the greatest climbers I've met over the years are very, very focused. The greatest climbers have also spent a huge amount of what you call time on task. So they do lots and lots of climbing. I've met many climbers over the years who are really good climbers, but actually if you look at the amount that they've climbed over the last 10 to 20 years, it's just less than the greatest. They're still doing plenty, but often they're maybe holding down a job, or they've got a family, or they've not got enough access to rock that they kind of could do with compared to the greatest. So I think that's another really big thing. And then lastly is injury avoidance and management. You will not find many of the greatest climbers in the world who have said, yeah, I have a nightmare with injuries. I don't manage them very well. I've had quite a lot of periods in my life where I've had a lot of time out.
Tom Randall, welcome to the Testpiece podcast, man. How are you doing?
Yeah, all good. How are you? Ready?
I'm ready. It's early over here. You're in the UK. You're in Lattice's podcasting studio, and it's the evening. And I'm impressed that you were able to do a podcast late night, because I drink lots of coffee, but I assume are you drinking coffee even though it's the evening there?
You know what? I used to be a total coffee addict, but I have come off it for, I think it might be going on 2 years now, because I randomly found out that it was giving me headaches. I thought it was supposed to be the thing that if you quit it, it gave you headaches, but actually it was giving me headaches. And now, I don't know. I still do drink a little bit of coffee, but like, I don't know, a few a week.
Yeah, I coffee totally gives me headaches when I don't drink it. So it's no big deal because I drink it all the time. Well, you are in Lattice's podcasting studio, which I just think is really cool. I definitely have never podcasted with someone who has an official studio. I mean, I take it back. I have an official studio. My wife just usually calls it our guest bedroom. So psyched to get to do this with someone who is used to podcasting. I didn't quite realize how big the last podcast was. I know you guys from assessments, coaching, and your YouTube channel, but I guess I don't consume as many podcasts as I should because, yeah, Tom, you're also a pro at podcasting. So thanks for joining me. I'm excited to learn from you too.
Well, we'll see how we get on with all of it. Maybe this is where it all goes wrong, when you've got two podcasters who have done a reasonable amount of it, and you join forces, and they delete each other.
I've heard people do these, like the two podcasters on a podcast, and what you find is that podcasters like to do this pause between each guest, and sometimes they'll overdo it. It's like they're really looking for that impact, and it doesn't sound like as normal of a conversation because they're used to putting on, like tightening up their tie and just having that stuffiness. So yeah, let's not do that. Let's talk about climbing, Tom. I like climbing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obsessed with it. I have been all of my adult life, so I'm very happy to talk about pretty much anything to do with climbing, that's for sure.
Well, you told me that you didn't need me to give you a big old intro, and you just said, like, let's just hop into it. And to me, that just shows everyone how accomplished you are. So just bear with me and let me just give the few listeners who haven't heard of you a little bit of context, because Tom, on top of founding Lattice, which is one of the biggest names in climbing now, you have FA'd multiple 514 trad routes. You've FA'd perhaps the world's hardest bouldering crack climb, which is a category I didn't know about until now, but now I feel like I want to go and check it out and see what it's like. You also, it blew me away when you told me that you'd free soloed, perhaps, I don't know if you claim this officially, but perhaps have free soloed more climbs in a 24-hour period than anyone. And I just wanted to hear a touch more about that, because I guess when I think of you, Tom, I don't think about you as being a wild, crazy free soloist. What's the story behind that?
Oh, it's actually what's the word? Is it the inception story? the starting point of mine and Pete Whitaker's climbing partnership. It was back in, I think it might have been like 2007 or something. And there was an established record for the most number of routes free soloed in a day. Of course, it's really good to do this in the Peak District in the UK because there's a lot of really short routes. So it's just perfect. Like, effectively, you spend probably half of the time in a you could fall off and not do yourself that much damage zone. So it's less risky. And you can do a lot of them because they're short and they're all next to each other. You just kind of work your way along these crags. And the record had been set by a couple of, I guess you call them semi-pro climbers back in the day, and held at about 500 routes climbed in a 24-hour period. And I'd that summer started to work towards breaking that record because I thought it was doable, but I just couldn't find anyone who wanted to do it with me because ultimately it's a little bit risky. It's not that enjoyable by the time you get to the end, and it requires quite a lot of logistics and commitment. And I just asked Pete, who was this kid, he was probably 16 years old or something, who was down the wall, whether he wanted to join me, thinking, I might as well ask him. He was a really good climber already. And in that youthful enthusiasm thing, he didn't even ask me many questions about it. He went, yeah, go on then, I'll do that. And he totally committed to it. And we ended up like 2 weeks later going and doing it and adding another 50 to the record that existed at the time. And everything about our partnership really was born from that whole high commitment, very, very rewarding escapade.
Oh, that's cool. That's a cool origin story or inception story. And yeah, you are one of the Wide Boyz. And there is something about, this is why I think climbing in general brings us together in such a tight way. And we have these friends for life, is there's something about risk and danger and also pushing yourself to the limit. Like, I'm sure you guys were a little tired after 20 hours of climbing, that you get to see what your friends are really made of, as well as show your true self. And so it's not surprising that kicked off a relationship. So this is off topic a bit, but tell me more about how you got so into crack climbing and how you started climbing in general in the Peak District. Because to be honest, I've never climbed there. I just, watched Hard Grit like 50 times and got, thought it was the coolest thing ever, but I don't know a ton about the climbing out there. And how'd you get into it?
So I started, I suppose, relatively late in climbing, about 17 years old, maybe like right at the last few months of 16 at school. And I came into it already being really into sport. I've been very, very into sport all of my life and had competed at a really good level in a couple of other sports, like a national level, done a lot of competitions, done a lot of training up to that point. And I had a friend who kind of got me into climbing, and that classic way, if you go and try something initially and you do well because you've already got, I suppose, an advantage, then you're hooked. And it just arrived at the right time in life and everything like that. Ended up really getting to climbing quickly, really good mentor who took me through everything. Chose to go to university based on Sheffield, where the Peak District is, as being the best place in the country. I'd read the magazines, Ben Moon, Jerry Moffat, John Dunn, everything seemed to happen there. So that just became the region that I gravitated towards. And that was where I got introduced to climbing, the Peak District, grit, soloing, everything else. Like the first day I ever had on grit without going out soloing. And that was just so much fun. I was like, this is flipping brilliant. And you can manage risk, but you've got really good friends and there's loads of climbing you can do. The movement's really interesting. And it was really over the next, I guess, 7 years or so through university and a bit of time after uni, I ended up just trying loads and loads of different parts of climbing out, lots of indoor climbing, got really into training because I already knew how to train pretty well from these other sports. I was quite methodological. I did a load of trad climbing, some sport climbing, just tried everything out, and eventually sort of fell into a bit of route setting because that seemed like a way to use your climbing but to earn a bit of money or free membership to a gym or whatever. And it was through doing that and eventually doing some paid work, I ended up in this scenario where I'd got really injured right when I'd first got what I would class as my proper route setting job. That was a real setback. Couldn't use my finger because I totally ruptured my pulley. I suspect now with the lens of having had multiple injuries over my career, I think I probably fully ruptured a couple of pulleys in the same finger because it was so bad. And at the time, I just ended up with this scenario of I just need to focus my energies somewhere. I'm trying to make my career in climbing as such, but as a route setter, and thought that crack climbing was really appealing because I'd already done a reasonable amount of it. I was relatively good at it compared to other things. And I just set myself some really, really ambitious goals at that stage with crack climbing. And I think it did sound absolutely ridiculous to people who were my close friends and climbing partners at the time. But I wanted to become the best in the world at doing that particular niche of climbing. And it was a ridiculous goal to come up to with, honestly, because I was climbing about probably 7C. So that's 12D and V6 or something. But I was like, I'm going for this. I'm really passionate about it.
Maybe I don't know the Peak District well enough, but I don't think of it as being a crack climbing mecca. I mean, there's cracks in all those routes because you have to be able to protect them. But when I think of again, I'm thinking of like Hard Grit, those iconic lines. I wouldn't call that crack climbing as I've seen you do it as as one of the Wide Boyz.
Yes, it's definitely not a specialist area for crack climbing, that's for sure. And we can always make pretty funny jokes about how you're trying to do a crack route that has 4 meters of crack climbing on it, and we'll call it a 3-star classic crack. But I suppose what went on behind the scenes that I don't know, there's a great deal of awareness of it, but my dad actually worked out of California for a number of years and was based over in Lancaster, which is sort of near the Air Force base there. And he essentially operated as my second home for quite a number of years. So I got a lot of access to Joshua Tree and Yosemite in particular. So actually I was getting a lot of exposure to that form of climbing, and I kind of cut my teeth in those early years with all that, with a bit of big walling, a bit of crack climbing. Never went to Indian Creek, interestingly, but yeah, I certainly had a foundation of that stuff for a number of years.
Well, you sure achieved your goal of becoming one of the best crack climbers. I'm curious, what makes someone a really, really high level crack climber as compared to, say, a face climber? Because I mean, you were climbing at least decently well on maybe more, I was going to say traditional, but I guess traditional would be more crack climbing. Yeah. What makes someone a really good crack climber, or what happens when cracks get really hard? And again, I'm sorry, I'm just not a super experienced crack climber. So this is just fun for me to learn about.
I suppose it comes down to having the specific skills and techniques for the terrain that you're working on that complement the same things that you have in every other form of climbing, which is strength, fitness, power endurance, flexibility, power, all of those different elements, psychology. And crack climbing has, I suppose, a different toolbox that you need in terms of those things. And that's why you can't take a 514 crack climber and instantly transform them to 514 face and vice versa, because they are quite different sports. There is crossover, and I think you find that there's almost more crossover than there should be, only because climbers tend to like most elements of climbing, so they're practicing all sorts of things. But there are rare climbers that I come across, especially like in Indian Creek, who almost avoid face climbing and never do it. And there, the split in grade is just huge. They can be climbing 513 cracks just all day long. I've seen them on site around that kind of level, but then you put them on a face climb and they're 4, 5, 6, 7 grades underneath. And it's just, a very, very different sport. And that's guys and girls. It's not a gender-based thing either.
Yeah, I think I've gotten more and more into crack climbing as I've gotten older, because I think they're just these beautiful lines. But when I came into climbing, it was kind of the era of sport climbing and sport climbing becoming a thing. And so what was kind of pushed then was, look at these beautiful faces that we previously couldn't even touch, and look at how blank this face is. And was a big departure from, look at this beautiful, like Indian Creek is just, I mean, perfect cracks, like just perfect, definitely not 4 meters, definitely more like 40-meter long cracks. So it's cool to, yeah, I love all climbing. And so it's cool to hear about someone who's taken a specific niche to such a high level, and where there's crossover and where there's not, because it's all just climbing. It's all just climbing.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Well, so how did that segue into, or in what time period did you found Lattice? So you had hurt your finger, you had started route setting, which all climbers at some point do a little bit of route setting for the gym membership or a couple extra bucks in their pocket. When did Lattice come about, and what was the impetus to start that?
Yeah, so the timeline more or less looked like, by about 2007, I was route setting semi-regularly, and then I think maybe 2007 to 2010, I did do quite a lot of route setting. Was working for a few different gyms, doing a bit of freelancing, but also having a sort of residency in one location. And one of the things that often happens is that when you work in a wall, you get offered other bits of work when it's appealing to you or you have the skill set. And because I'd already done quite a lot of coaching within martial arts previous to climbing, it felt quite appealing to do some kind of form of coaching for youth climbers at the gym. And so I had this interest in it, and I was asking quite a lot about training and coaching from others down the gym, and generally exploring ideas. But I think, if I remember rightly, what actually happened was I saw a job to manage the GB climbing team come up as like a voluntary job for the national body right at the start. And I did that for a year, just thinking, oh, I should just throw myself in the deep end and see what happens. I'm reasonably good at being able to manage people, projects, and ideas. I'll just have a go. I mean, it's voluntary, so they probably can't complain too much because they're not paying me to do this. And that gave me access to a whole load of really high level climbers, and then also working with coaches who are doing training plans. And I got to sort of experience and witness what made up that top 0.01% of the climbing population in the country at the time, and the problems that it presented on the whole for performance and progress through it. And I did that for about a year or so, I think, and then kind of then fell into a job of coaching, but with the junior British team, and ended up doing that for around 3 or 4 years, I think, and also working as a coach within the gym that I was a route setter. And it ended up being this really interesting, I suppose, hybrid blend of work, that I was working for a national team that had somewhat of a methodology of how to train people, and this is what we do, and this is how you support these athletes. But then I had my own kids that I was training and coaching at the gym, but that was just complete freestyle, like just guinea pig them, do what you fancy in a way, because the gym owner wasn't particularly fussy about how you did things, as long as they were happy and they were coming in and paying their class fees and the parents were happy and everything like that. So I did loads of experimental work. It probably sounds terrible now. But over those years, I really refined how to write and structure training programs, how to talent spot, how to motivate individuals, how to give them a long-term pathway within the sport, and how they would ultimately then perform on both bouldering and sport climbing. And that eventually kind of petered out in a way because I got frustrated with the mechanism of working with a national body, or the lack of funding, didn't really want to go further with things. And that's where, if I remember rightly, I kind of just went off and started on my own, thinking, I just want to start collecting data and testing climbers, because I kind of got into that already with a junior team and doing bits and pieces. I knew some of the senior team from before were interested in it, and I came up with a method for how I would test strength and fitness for climbers, and collected data from a board which I had that I constructed in my back garden, really basic thing, which is the original Lattice board. And also did a little bit of experimental work of writing training programs with people to see if I could take the test results and then get them further, because I was fairly convinced that the problem was that people couldn't really understand where they were at. They were just really subjective about performance and where they were at physically as a climber. And I wanted to be able to move the notch along a little bit, but then also see whether that actually worked. And that was kind of where the whole Lattice concept of assessments plus training plans came up to. And at the same time, I met Ollie Tor, who I co-founded Lattice with, who was also coaching and operating a bit like me, doing a bit of in-person stuff, a few training plans. We had a really small number of clients, but he was a very different type of coach to me. Very, very almost like yin and yang of coaching style and methods and our own backgrounds. Me really fit, him really strong, complemented each strengths and weaknesses. And I think I just sat him down one day and went, should we join forces? And I think we could do something together here. I'd really like to have you join me. We'll amalgamate our client base and let's try and go for this whole thing of working with people, making really good training programs and doing the assessments, and let's build it out, like make an actual company, not just an individual.
Gosh, I remember when Lattice assessments hit the scene, it was a really big departure from what had come before, because what had come before was nothing really, where it was just us all experimenting on ourselves and not really quantifying anything. And I have a hunch that people don't remember that 10 years ago, training and knowing your metrics and even knowing what size edges were on hangboards, or just that concept was so foreign. And it was a big, I remember my buddy first getting an assessment. We were like, what is this? Like he gets an email and he had to you really started the ball rolling. And I just want to highlight how interesting it was at the time to see quantification in climbing. And I'm wondering about, I want to hear what sport you were competing at such a high level and how you brought those ideas into climbing in the beginning, because I think you kind of hinted at there being no real structure in the climbing teams. And so what did you feel like you pulled out of your past experiences in sport and brought to climbing, which maybe now seems obvious, but perhaps wasn't at the time?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think probably two things. One was from athletics, which was the first sport that I suppose I had a much more serious approach with. And I started doing a lot of very systematic, consistent, and what would have been classed even back in those days as being maybe over the top amounts of training for a junior. Like I was in the weights gym from 11 years old, multiple times per week. And that wasn't very normal back then. It was unusual to put kids in the gym and have them doing that much and sticking with it. And what was good about it was there was a lot of really frequent testing and assessment of metrics that were associated with things that weren't directly related to performance. So they were your basic tests around, how many pull-ups could you do, particular kind of lever lift style core stuff, because we did a lot of core training and floor-based work, weights-based work. And you had these matrices that you would reference, and over time you'd be able to track how you were doing with your training. And it was a good way to see whether it kind of held you accountable to the work that you would put in, but also act as a motivator to think, oh, you know what, I didn't do that well in this season, but I've seen that my metrics from my physical training have gone forward. So it's not like a sunk cost that I'm not seeing any return from. I'm just going to work out how to convert it. And that was really good to see that systemized, and experienced it myself as an athlete and know how motivating it was, but also how objective it was. And I really enjoyed that. And then on the other side of it was I also did quite a bit of martial arts during my mid to late teenage years and kind of early 20s. And in that sport, I thought that the training was really not very well evolved. And I, in a way, did my first bits of trialing this whole do lots of reading, find a niche, a way that other people aren't doing things, and just hammer it to really play to your advantages over other athletes or other competitors, and work it quite scientifically, quite systematically, and with a lot of focus. And I had some really good success by doing that because the sport was quite unevolved in terms of its training, and I was just getting returns from the work that I was putting in that were kind of unfair. And I was like, this is brilliant. I'm suddenly winning all the competitions because I haven't maybe got the cleverest way of doing things, but I've definitely found a lot of focus, and I've really hammered home a few training points, which have ended up transferring well to performance.
That's interesting about this idea of really leaning into a strength versus bringing up your weaknesses and when to do which. And how does that work in climbing compared to martial arts? I would think that sometimes you can, well, actually, I don't want to hazard a guess. What do you think about when you think about balancing, leaning into your strengths versus your weaknesses when it comes to being a climber?
I think at the end of the day, the answer is you should do both, but the methods are maybe a little different, or the approaches are different. So where I think it can be misunderstood is that you have to pay attention to your weaknesses and work them almost in a turtle-like manner, just ticking over consistently on them year after year after year, because often they are your weaknesses because you either have a physiological, let's call it, disadvantage, or a mental one, or a technical one, or whatever it is, and your returns are not going to be maybe the same as another athlete who has it as already an advantage and something that they're just leaning into straight away. So you tick away at it, and for the most part, you will see the returns. It'll just take a longer time. But at the same time, sort of like the other side, the flip of the coin, is to really work and hone in and become a master of the things that your advantages as such within any sport. So in climbing, I think we have to try and remember that it's going to be a physical, a technical, tactical, psychological aspect of the sport, and everyone has them. And I think you become a really good person if you could identify what they are in all of those areas. But you've got to really push it, and it's not easy to get that last 1%. Doing, 9 out of 10 of the work blocks and the reward blocks on anything, it's okay. Just put the graft in. Getting that last bit is hard.
Yeah, climbing is just so varied, and even in like the same rock type in the same area, sometimes it will really speak to a strength of mine. I'm just talking about personally, and it will make me feel like a superhero, like a champ. And then there will be some kind of move or hold that will expose a glaring weakness, and it can just be so brutal because you can do these two things where you try to look around to figure out your way up. Yeah, you go, oh, okay, look, I can't use this micro crimper because I'm a dynamic thuggy climber, and oftentimes you can bypass it and do something special. But it's this weird balance, because really the best climbs in the world often test a myriad of skills. It's what makes climbing so beautiful, is there's often these, I like to call them gates on good climbing. It's like, oh, great, but can you mantle? Okay, like, great, you pulled off the really hard crux campus, but now you can't do the mantle. And it's this thing that I always jump back and forth on, because when we see the best in the world they demonstrate their greatness through some kind of beautiful, innate, I don't know, finger strength or one arm pull, and you just are wowed by it. But then their weaknesses still seem so high. And it's always hard for me to understand how to balance it, because on one side, sometimes I just think, be good at what you're good at, and then find your way through the areas by using your methodology and thinking with an open mind. But sometimes a climb will just have your number. And it's just something that I feel like is a forever game to play. And so I love hearing people's takes on it.
Yeah, I mean, even the best climbers in the world will have things which open up all of their, maybe not all of their weaknesses, but a number of their weaknesses, and suddenly things look really, really hard for them again. And you might see them not be able to achieve the grades that they would expect elsewhere. And I think that holds true in pretty much every discipline. And like, even for example, I think a good way to see this is you could take a number of the world's best climbers, let's call them, it could be sport climbers or boulderers, and they have spent the last 10 to 20 years climbing outside on rock. They maybe climb a little bit in the gym to do some training, system board training, but they're mostly rock climbers, we'll say. You put them on a World Cup center stage in front of 10,000 people with a time limit and a route on a texture and a style of climbing that they haven't seen. They're directly competing against their peers, and it's going to be utterly obvious if they're not the best in the world at what they're doing, and most of them will just completely fall apart because it's right there and then pulled up a massive mental weakness, which is they don't have any degree of familiarity with the setting. They don't have confidence in it. They don't have experience in it. They're flipping amazing climbers, and they're some of the best climbers on rock outside, but you found one very obvious weakness. It pulls people down.
It does strike me, though, that some of the climbers that we look up to the most, I'm just going to say Adam Ondra, because why not bring his name into some of the best, where it is so impressive how adaptive they are, where Adam, I don't know Adam. I've never climbed with him. My hunches is that he's extremely strong, but I'm not sure that when you look at Adam, you would say, oh, he's just physically the strongest ever. But his ability to, well, like I think about going and doing the Dawn Wall, the Yosemite multi-pitch, or when he went to Indian Creek, I believe he on-sighted a hard 513 crack climb. And I'm not disagreeing with you, Tom. There's something about climbing that when you see people who we like to call, like, you are a really good climber, they somehow seem to be able to say, oh, this is a dual tex indoor hold, I'm going to use it like this, because they have some fundamentals built in. And yeah, no question. They're just kind of, it's interesting where you see these really good quote unquote climbers, and sometimes they exhibit something with adaptability that is hard to trace back to just strength and familiarity. That's something I always strive for when I want to be a quote unquote better climber. You're like, what does that really mean? And it's that demonstration sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, Adam is an exceptional individual, and if you look back at his history of climbing, I think you'll find he's extremely varied in what he does across all disciplines, rock types, countries that he's traveled to, situations that he's put himself into. And so he is an unusual thing. I think there is a danger sometimes. Like I've noticed this when I do either interviews and stuff, and we love to pull up our Adam Ondras or our Yanyas or Alex Magos or anything like that. And we say, this is our example and this is the person that we're going to break down. I don't think it's actually, I'm going to say it, I don't think it's that relevant and that valuable for the general climber, because they don't represent the rest of us, I'm going to say. And I'm going to put myself in that, or to a degree, I'm going to put myself in that package. And so you have to be careful how much you break them down and try and apply it to yourself.
That's fair. I hear what you're saying. Well, then let's rewind and go back to Lattice's founding or these early assessments that I got to see over here in America. I feel like that's how it kind of trickled over to my neck of the woods. And this idea of objective metrics was tantalizing. And I think even just, you said, let's start collecting data. But I think what makes good data is kind of like consistency. There was plenty of data in the sense that people were climbing and hanging on stuff, but there was no baseline on which to compare it. And so I'm wondering what was tested back then and how has it evolved into today? What were the metrics you were looking at then and why did you choose them and how are they done today?
Yeah, so back in the day, what I focused almost exclusively on was the level of finger strength that an individual had, and then how would that play out in a power endurance setting and a recovery setting. So what I used to have people do was to do a single arm dead hang test on a 20 mil, like a single joint edge, and do that with both their arms. And then I would put them on the lattice board, which was meant to be a grid of climbing that was totally predictable, that I could get a climber to learn with it. Like a good climber will learn how to climb on a lattice board within 15 minutes or so. It's so predictable. Every move's the same. And because I wanted to take the technical element out of it and the psychological element as much as possible, because there's no climbing above the bolt. There's no fear about being higher up or anything. You're literally bouldering on a grid that just goes round and round and round. But I also wanted to represent climbing in the sense that it was built on a diagonal. So a lot of the principles of how I made that wall originally was to represent how we actually route set indoors. If you look at a lot of routes indoors and you actually draw grid lines through the holes on the wall, they will actually often operate on diagonals like a gridded system. It won't be totally uniform, but that's kind of what works well for movement. So I went along those lines. And so I wanted to see, right, how strong are you? Now, how long can you use that strength for at an intensity that's going to be in that kind of 50, 60, 70% of your maximum intensity? So what's your power endurance? What's the durability of that strength that you have? And then I put them through a number of repeated tests where they would increasingly do the same tests again and again, but they'd have intermittent recovery periods that would match the work time that they'd had on the board to then understand the level of recovery that they would have. Because my belief at the time was good route climbers, because I was focused on route climbers, were a function of strength, because you need to pull really hard moves and you can't, if you have no strength, you have nothing left to endure, that classic phrase. But also, once you've understood the level of power endurance, you do need a big element of recovery ability, because that also represents what occurs in a true climbing setting. So I was trying to make a test which represented with a high degree of specificity what occurs in climbing, but it had to be consistent and systemized. And this was my effort to encapsulate a climbing experience as best as possible, like a treadmill of route climbing. That's what it was meant to be.
Totally makes sense. I mean, those are, especially if you're focusing on route climbing, breaking down to those, the most fundamental little building blocks that you could. So when we fast forward to today, do you still do those same tests? Like what has changed? I'm guessing that those are still kind of some of the areas you want to focus on because those will never change. But how have the testing methods changed or added to what was done back then?
So the first thing was we adapted the way that we would do our endurance and power endurance testing. The science that I was using back at the time made some critical, let's call them, assumptions and how I thought that the physiology, biochemistry would work in terms of the fatigability and recovery of a muscle. And some methods developed and became more popular within sports science, particularly through cycling. They're a little bit more robust. So we moved our methodology to be more in line with that. And that ended up occurring on a fingerboard rather than a lattice board. It's a lot simpler. More people could do that at home. And that's more around what you might see in the literature as referred to as critical force or critical power testing. Loads of good papers around it, and you can read quite a lot in the sort of general sort of everyday available literature. And then we built in with that a lot more testing around the strength and conditioning of a climber in their upper body. So taking into account core strength and also the shoulders, because we start to understand as coaches and trainers that aspect is actually really important as well. And we weren't really paying enough attention to it because we wanted to work with people long term. We also wanted to understand why sometimes someone has freakishly strong fingers, but it just doesn't seem to play out that well elsewhere, or they seem to get injured all the time and have so much potential, but we couldn't seem to understand what was going on with it. So we did that, added a load more strength and conditioning work. And then over the last few years, we've built it out into being a full sort of suite of testing where you can do the full in-depth analysis on flexibility. And there's a whole range of different tests that you do. And you'll take photos of yourself and measure the angles in different positions. And then a number of tests, sort of protocols that you can follow through a different number of level of climbers that actually take you a few different sessions, and you just go away and do those and then kind of report back the data, and then that gets analyzed. So it's really built out a lot over the years. And I mean, I was just looking at it the other day for some testing that I'm doing out in Germany next week, and I was going, oh, crikey, that's changed a bit. I need to have a look out to do this.
It's cool that you've added on so much. I do think that back 10, 15 years ago, when we thought about climbing, we did think more just about kind of fingers and endurance, and especially in the route climbing world. You know, I came from the era of kind of the French climbers being the ones. And when you looked at them, I don't think you thought of shoulder power exactly. You kind of thought like, could they hold on to it? Could they keep on moving? And then they would just fall off, and you think, oh, like, well, they must have not had the endurance. So it's cool to see it evolve. And I feel like our sport has kind of noticed that, hey, perhaps the whole chain needs to be there to support the fingers. And I just, this is a little tangent, by I'm curious about power, endurance, and recovery. I'm more of a boulder than a sport climber, but I've done quite a bit. And for me, what I notice in sport climbing is that in some ways it's the ability to rest on holds that is the determiner of success, rather than like power endurance, where it seems like, of course, I'm going to get tired doing a series of moves. And if I can go to the middle of the crux, or if I can shake out right before the crux, then I have a lot more success. I want to understand the role of power endurance versus recovery. And is there a big correlation when you would test people? Like, is it that people who could recover really quickly and well had better power endurance, or were they completely separate? Does that make sense? Gosh, that's a little convoluted way to ask it.
I know what you're asking there. And the answer is that there is a good relationship between having a good degree of power endurance and recovery. But what I think it's important for people to understand is that power endurance operates on a spectrum of intensity. So in a way, you can actually think of every individual climber as being, or having the capacity to be like a superstar at 50% intensity, 60%, 70%. And you can flux this through training. And I think there's also a sort of genetic predisposition towards certain levels of intensity and how well you operate in the power endurance zone. So you might see climbers who say, I am really good in that 3 to 4 minute category. I always have been. That's my thing. Other people will say, I always struggle to perform well in that zone, but you give me something where I'm on there for 20 minutes, that's me all the way. So I think we need to understand that there's a spectrum of it. And so if anyone tries to reference an individual performance of power endurance against their recovery rate, they need to be aware that, do they understand the full spectrum of how they do? Because they might be misreading something through a single incident. So that's one thing to pay attention to. And then the other is that recovery really, in my experience with training and coaching and getting someone somewhere in a long time, like over multiple years of training, is that recovery is a long game and it takes many years to get good at. So that's why you can have this, what's the word? Non-correlation, because a climber who has done lots of high volume, kind of aerocat continuity style training over the years, lots of trad climbing, perhaps just been climbing a lot, can actually have a really good recovery rate because that's the long game and they've got there with that. But in any particular season, maybe they haven't climbed that much, they haven't done much fitness, and their power endurance looks awful. And that's why you can get that separation there. And likewise, fit young climbers who are great on power endurance haven't yet done the years, and their recovery can not be that good. Or boulderers who have just been converting from being a boulderer into a sport climber. They've done like 2 years worth of, let's call it conversion, become a new type of climber. And they're like, but I still not very good at recovery. That's the bit I can't get. And I'm like, put in another 5 years. This thing's going to take time. I'm sorry, you can't instantly hack it.
Oh man, that's always the response is you actually have to earn it. And it's really cool though to think that you could go get tested and it could tell you, or maybe give you a hint at where your superpower lies in what percentage of intensity. Because I've not only am I more of a boulder, but even when I started out sport climbing, I would head towards shorter routes. I really would struggle. I would always be able to do the crux, but then I would fall on the easy bit. And I'd have a buddy who, if he could pull off the crux move, he could climb whatever grade for, it seemed like an infinite amount of time. And I just thought, boy, like, is that something that I'm misunderstanding? But it makes me feel better to know that maybe there's just a predisposition. But do you see that in the testing where you're like, hey Joe, you can go forever at a really low intensity, but you're not like your friend, Tim, who can hang out at 80% for forever.
Yeah, you see a big spectrum of people through testing, and it's always an interesting conversation that you have with an individual, but then you're trying to build a plan towards a goal and trying to moderate how much expectation you give them of how achievable certain things are. Because if you're too far out, then it doesn't matter with the highest amount of motivation and the best methods, you can only get the body to change a certain amount in a certain period. And that's always, I suppose, the role of the coach is to find a realistic middle ground.
But having that information can really help you approach things with a better tactic, where if you know that you're going to struggle on maybe, a 80% kind of like outro where it's still high level, what you have to understand is you go, okay, I'm going to do what I can to find as good a rest as I can right here. And now I'm going to sprint this, because that's something that I do when I sport climb and I haven't built up fitness, is I go, okay, I'm going to be on a ticking time bomb, no matter how many good, quote unquote, good rests there are. So I use my ability to climb a little bit quicker, a little bit more risky to run through. And just having that information, you can change your tactics. And it's what's so great about climbing is this is you, but how you apply that knowledge is, can be really powerful.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tool that you can use with a great deal of cunning if you really want to do that. And I've had a few, I suppose, criticisms over the years from people that say, but aren't you just opening up the door for climbers to now basically see what they're really good at and avoid the things that they're not so good at, and people just become specialists because they now understand more objectively what they could do? And I'm like, yeah, I get it. And you could argue that people are going to stop becoming such broad generalists within climbing. But ultimately, I think this comes down to the philosophy of it's good to share information and give people an open book and let them make the decision of what they want to do. I'm certainly not going to push anyone into a particular route. It depends on what they're motivated towards doing.
Well, and people already know that you always have that friend who can crimp the heck out of anything, but then refuses to ever touch a sloper. And you just think to yourself, I know you're good at that, but climbing, there's a lot of fun to be had in all sorts of disciplines, and maybe you do have to swallow your ego, but I think that there's a personality type that is going to choose the hard thing that they know will maybe get them better, or just kind of head towards their rabbit hole of just, only and I feel like that classic crimp strength is maybe, at least for my era, it was like you have these people who just are unbelievably good at crimping and will never touch another hold and complain. But yeah, I don't think we can stop that. I think you're doing a service, not a disservice.
Yeah, I mean, that's what climbing's there for in the evenings, debating.
So in these metrics, you just said something that's interesting, where we can take these metrics and get really nerdy about how to apply that. And that's where a coach can help you understand where you may not get so good, but there may be areas you are good at, and formulating a plan to have success. What it made me think about is when you're testing normal people, but also when you're testing elite people, how much variation are you seeing within a grade? So the example there would be maybe a quote unquote average climber is climbing 5'11", and how much variability do you see in 10 climbers' finger strength and all the other metrics? And is that any different from the elite level?
So yeah, if you look at the spectrum of your intermediate climber to advanced to elite, and whether you see a narrowing of, I guess, data in terms of physical metrics, then the answer is no, you don't see a narrowing of data, other than it needs to be acknowledged that there's a smaller data pool of elite climbers compared to the general population. So when you model it and you create, you put stuff on a graph, it gives the appearance, when you pull things to, like, you look at the standard deviation, for example, is it's going to get smaller as you get your groups becoming smaller, because you have less and less outliers that exist there. And they often are a more, what's the word? Standard type of pro elite climber that comes to you for assessments. You don't see, let's say you don't see the full spectrum of pro climbers who come to Lattice to come and get tested. I think it's less representative of the general climbing population that come to get tested with us. We see like everyone in your, let's say, V5 to V11 range, but then above, yeah, there's a bit more of a type there. And I think that does affect the data to some respect. But always with these things is you do have to remember that every pro climber was an intermediate and an advanced climber at some point. They have to be. They didn't suddenly arrive at a pro climber. So everyone's been along the pathway of the sort of the data or the metrics as such in all those different areas.
That's kind of cool to hear that it doesn't necessarily change a bunch where you have strengths and weaknesses throughout the grade range. I know you put that caveat in of perhaps you're not seeing as broad a swath of the elite climbers, so you don't want to make as a strong opinion there. I'm wondering if you're seeing more people who you deem too strong for their grade, and that's a very general term, or too weak for their grade, and also if that's changed over the decade that you've been looking at the data.
Yeah, so we definitely had not a transition, but an evolution of the data and how the models changed in the early years, because when we first started out testing, we tested almost exclusively British climbers, and those are cellar trained, relatively unfit, limestone loving crimp beasts. And with retrospect, it definitely skewed the model towards you have to be flipping strong for the grade. And I remember when we compared initially to a lot of the Europeans and especially Americans, actually, they came out as performing really low on the grade spectrum for those levels of strength that they had, especially in the fingers. And with time, that model evened out just basically through just collecting more and more data over time. And I think that is sort of standard within any form of data set. And it's interesting, in the sort of, once we've been doing that for a number of years, I'd occasionally get sent data sets from other individuals who'd collected data informally, or someone else had been doing it systematically, but only in one region for a while. And they would ask me to have a look at their data sets and whether it was, I wasn't able to share exactly what we were doing, but I could take a look and say, yeah, this is in line with what we're doing. You're not a million miles out, because they'd be kind of worried that they didn't have enough data or something like that. And actually, you'll find a lot of the data sets globally that people have collected, once they've done it for enough time, they all look about the same. And actually, that's quite reassuring. But the sort of the clever bit, I suppose, is when you start to build models which can account for lots of different factors, and you build these multifactorial models that account for gender, height, weight, sport specialization, and then you can do something that's a lot more detailed, and actually you see the grade boundaries tighten up, and you can be a little bit more, I suppose, predictive or accurate about your models when it comes to physical strengths, which isn't unexpected. I mean, of course it is, because you start filtering down for specifics. And that was really interesting. We spent a bit of time working with a PhD and master's student for a while, and altering our models and moving things around in that sense. But actually, over time, we moved to a slightly broader model, because it just ended up being a little less, hard work to maintain these models and constantly move them around according to the evolving data set. And we lent in more to our general training methodology and moved our focus a little bit less, or a little bit more away from the data.
It's wild that your data set just is going to keep getting better and better and better. And, that, I think I know what multifactorial model means as you described it, but just, it must be cool telling young Tom how much data you guys have collected now. And, something that I want to talk about with you is that when you brought this quantification into climbing, or, I mean, it had been done a little bit before, but I felt like you guys really brought the era of hard training and quantification in when you guys started. And now I'd say there's pushback against it. It's become such a obvious thing that maybe people spend too much time focusing on their metrics and not enough time on rock. And how do you feel about the pendulum swinging so far? And how do you think about using metrics to become fundamentally a better climber?
Yeah, you're right in the sense that sometimes things can go too far in one direction, and intuitively, I think people can sense that when it happens in any sport. And I think this can happen over things like doing metrics for strength or fitness within sport. It can happen when everyone spends too much time just training on flat system boards because they've got LEDs and they've got a really nice app associated with them, or we do run and jump problems everywhere in comp climbing and everyone's, not doing a different style of climbing. And I think nowadays I sit in a position where I feel it was really important for us to, especially as a business, but also trying to change the industry, that we really focused, and probably overly focused, if I think about it, on one very particular aspect of our method, which was objectively test, then build training programs off the back of this, because it stood for something, it represented something, and people could get behind it, and they knew what they were getting involved with. And it allowed us to not get distracted by a whole number of other ways to improve as a climber and really hone and become total experts in that thing. And that took like 10 years or so. And I think this is kind of the one of the things that's true in life, is that you can do everything and you can take a really broad approach. But if you want to be world class in something, you kind of got to put a few things to the side and say, yeah, I know that might not be perfect and that might not be what I can do right now. But you know what? I've got what I'm doing here and I think this is going to work. But I'm going to have things ticking over in the background so that it all comes together with time. And that's where I see it with the data and metrics nowadays, is that for 10 years now, ourselves and others have been collecting data and have really moved that forward in climbing. And there's plenty of understanding about it now. But in the background, there's been loads more of evolution in terms of technique within climbing, the psychology of climbing, and also the openness of people having to tactics for like working in particular, like projecting. There's so much on social media and written on blogs about how to do that nowadays compared to 10 years ago. It's almost like a secret sauce of what people are actually getting up to. And we're in a really nice position now where I think you can take all of those elements and become a really good climber. And it's just that we focus on one thing.
Yeah, hopefully I didn't come off too negative in that. To me, what you guys did was open up another toolbox, or put another tool in a tool kit for us to get better at climbing. And some of my pushback when people don't love metrics is, or think that, you know, people are too obsessed with metrics, is I often say, hey, if someone wants to be a champion hangboarder, like, you know, people used to make fun of bouldering. People used to make fun of sport climbing. Like, who are we to tell people what they want to pursue? And if they want to, you know, because bouldering was training for real climbing, and it became a thing unto itself. So I love just the idea of adding more tools to the toolbox, and it's up to the climber themselves and the coaches they work with to use them appropriately. So I'm curious, how do you like to use metrics, or how do you see them fitting into maybe even just your climbing?
Yeah, so I think in terms of my own climbing, and actually a lot of people that I've worked with over the years, is that the greatest emphasis on metrics is often in the initial stages. I kind of call it, you could think of it as like a phase of discovery about a climber and trying to build a really good objective picture about where they are, because most people know where they want to go with their climbing. And if you can reference your objective measures, it gives you something to work towards. It gives you your areas of where you put your focus and intention into your climbing. And that's where I would say 75% of the value and the ongoing process, not ongoing process, but the ongoing value in testing is for most people, including myself. Like, I did loads of testing in my early professional years as such, but then there's still a bit of value in doing these ongoing tests to basically track how you're moving forward as an athlete, especially if you're trying out new training methods, or you want to know whether things are working and you're responding to things in the correct way, or even if you're just trying to break through a plateau and you're just not really understanding where you're at with things, and you can just go back to some tests again and go, all right, you know what? I didn't quite realize that those things were so poor at present. I didn't notice it because generally I'm climbing about the same. I'm just a bit off, but a few objective measures can be really useful for doing that. So I would say for most people, including myself, emphasize that initial point as like a phase of discovery and understanding you, and then just intermittent tests, because I don't like the idea that the general climbing population spend every month or every 2 weeks going back and doing a load of tests and just putting all their mental focus and energy into just tracking something which isn't a direct measure of climbing performance. You can be really careful of that, just a little bit. Otherwise it becomes its own thing and it's not climbing anymore.
Something that I've been blessed with over the years is great climbing partners that tell me when I suck at something or do something in my face that I think I should be able to do and I can't do. And I often think that you may not know your weaknesses, but your friends might. And that's great that I've been lucky enough to, over the years, had a lot of climbing partners, but not everyone is in the same boat. And it's hard to know what you're not so good at. And sometimes I try to explain scenarios where I'm like, hey, this might be a hint that you struggle with X, like in the classic crimper thing, where it's like, if you're the person who never wants to climb on slopers, perhaps there's something there for you, especially if you're looking to excel in other areas. And the question I have around this is, when you test, let's say, intermediate climbers versus elite climbers, are intermediate climbers more often surprised, or can they predict what they are going to be bad at? Do they say, oh yeah, boy, not surprised when you told me that I'm not so good at X, Tom? And how do elite climbers, are they better able to determine what their weaknesses are?
Yeah, on the whole, advanced elite level climbers are much better at knowing themselves and where they're at with things. And I wouldn't say it's that common that they're surprised by the results that come out, especially so with the climbers in the pro climber level that are really good generalists and can do lots of different things. I think because they've just had this feedback for years of, well, I can do slabs, but I can't do overhangs. I'm great on a moon board, but I'm terrible when I won't go and do a compy style set somewhere. They just have so much feedback. And your intermediate level climbers are forever surprised. But I think it's because climbing is really complex and there's so many things to look at, and you've got to understand what to look at, what is, in air quotes, good and bad, and then how do you even work these out? And that's a lot to take on in your early years of climbing, where cognitively it's not an easy sport. Like, it's still the hardest sport I've ever tried in my life. It's hard to get good at climbing.
Yeah, I'm 30 years deep, still, started a podcast to try to figure out how to get better. On this idea of quantification and metrics, I've thought I've seen you guys do a YouTube where you, I want to say, try to quantify some of technique, maybe the amount of weight one puts on a hold on your foot or your hands. How much have you gone down that area? Because again, climbing is so complex, and technique, that we say technique, it's like, what the heck do we mean by technique? It's infinitely complex, but have you guys taken a stab at some of that? And what are you looking to do in that area?
So I do know of this video, and I actually haven't watched the video itself on our YouTube channel, so I can't really claim any particular knowledge on this, other than there won't have been any, rigorous testing or great findings, because I didn't hear it being talked about further, which tells me that probably what we were doing on that was something that was fun and experimental, and we were trying some things out. I'm guessing, if I remember rightly, there's some force gauges on some holds on the wall. I did a very similar thing, something like 7 or 8 years ago, with some force gauges as well, and tried some different climbers out. And I ended up actually experimenting whether frogged climbing positions on the wall or drop knee positions were more efficient in terms of getting your weight off your hands, because I was a bit obsessed with, like, oh, what type of flexibility should I working? Because if one's way more efficient at getting your weight off your hands, I'm totally going to go for that one. And what I found with my bit of experimentation that I did at home, that they were basically the same. And it led me with, all right, okay, yeah, that's fair enough. You have to be good at frogging and you need to be good at drop knees. There is no secret here, unfortunately.
Gosh, yeah, that's what's so great about, I think of this more in sport climbing and just watching amazing sport climbers be extremely efficient up a long wall. And it's, when do you frog? When do you drop knee? When do you twist? And just this, I'll never forget, I was climbing on, what's that thing? Los Humildes Picasa, which is like this massive thing in Oleana, and I was a boulderer, and it kicked my butt. It really kicked my butt. And a woman it was her first, 13D or 14, whatever, on site. And she just walked up and did it. And she was very excited. And I asked my buddy, how come, cause I was bouldering pretty well at the time. He was like, oh no, Josh, you're just not a very good rock climber. And I was like, oh, thanks, man. Thanks. And I was like, what do you mean? I'm strong. I can do these moves. He's like, yeah, but did you see how that decision making and that understanding of body? But this is the thing about the reason why I bring up the idea of quantifying technique is that I would argue that when you brought some of that quantification into finger strength and endurance training, it probably, you could argue, it seemed just as wild and strange. But this is how our sport progresses: is you choose something to quantify, and we get data about it, and then you over time you say, is this data helping us understand climbers and plug holes where they need to be plugged? And so I think it would be reasonable to argue that at some point we're going to try to quantify some level of technique, and maybe it won't be perfect, but it's going to be an area that gets tackled. And I don't know, I encourage you to watch that video because it was fun. It's been a while since I watched it, but it got my mind going,
Yeah, it's got huge potential, and we've had discussions about it over the years here at Lattice. I've met quite a few researchers that have come up with ideas around it, and really what it looks like is having some form of system board which has a load of sensors on it, and you have it all the way, all over the board, and you can understand how much force, the rate at which that force is applied, peak force, on each hand and foothold. And then you have climbers of all different types compete these things, and you start to build up a database again of how these things are climbed and what are the limiting factors and what are the end ranges of force applied on each thing. And then if you can do that in a live sense, you can have people go back, and in the coach setting in particular, you can say, right, you've seen there that you have pushed way under what all other people have completed this problem on the board on that foothold. You need to be much more intentional about the push on that foothold. You start to get that feedback. Maybe they do it, maybe they don't, but maybe they just understand how to push more on that foothold. And I think that's a really interesting development that for sure has potential within climbing. It'll be expensive. That's part of the problem with this, is doing any of these kind of projects is time consuming and it's expensive. I mean, all the data stuff that I did at Lattice, I collected that data for a long, long time off my own back for no money at all, because I was just interested in it. But if you had to pay someone to go and do it, then it would be quite expensive. And I had a board which I just roughed up out of a load of wood, and I didn't do it properly. But if you were doing it properly, you would have to have, all the safety features of it. You'd have to do load testing. It wasn't.
Yeah, you got to start somehow.
Yeah.
I just think that there's something about those tight feedback loops that are really powerful. You can imagine if you're trying to teach someone to put weight on a foot, you're like, hey, get your knee over your toes. What are you doing? And I'm just making things up here. You can imagine if the more weight you put on the foot, it turns greener versus redder. And just that quick coupling is really powerful. And I actually would argue that's why some of the testing you do with metrics is so powerful, is because sometimes, maybe it's the summertime and you're climbing the gym and you go, am I getting stronger? I don't know. And then you finally get on the project that you were on last season, and sure enough, you're climbing better. And the tighter you can show yourself progress, it's motivating, and it helps you learn. And so it's fun going out into the future, imagine what could be possible. Yeah. But this idea of testing finger strength and kind of where you guys got started is still, geez, Tom, fingers pretty important for climbing. And you told me that perhaps you were one of the quote unquote weaker fingered climbers and maybe that is why some of your interest in this stuff has carried you along for so long. Can you tell me about your journey of going from maybe having not so strong fingers to where you are now, and what that looked like?
Yeah, so I represent your classic weak but really fit climber. I can, if I do strength training, even with the knowledge of what I have now, the returns are relatively poor compared to most people. If I do fitness training, I get amazing returns, and it's like unfair on both sides, and I fully recognize that. And that's been the way always for me as a climber. Reverse back to when I first met Ollie Tor, who I started up Lattice with. He was the exact opposite of me. Outrageously strong fingers, but so unfit. And it was a really interesting scenario where we were doing this testing. We knew each other well as friends. And we're like, why do we not climb sort of like the same grade? And you're so much stronger, but why can you not hang on? He's like, but you're so weak. How can you hang on so long? And we kind of, threw loads of ideas out. We climbed a lot together. We tested each other. We tried to understand what was happening. And at some point, I can't remember if Ollie said to me or I said to Ollie, I was like, right, why don't you just take me as a guinea pig and use the Ollie method? Tell me what your secrets are. Like, just train me. I'll do what you want me to. I've got nothing to lose anymore. I don't seem to be getting any stronger, and I'll follow it. And because I would like stronger fingers, because I think they're basically the limiting factor now. I can't seem to get any fitter. And what he did was do two things, really, if you really boil it down, is he got me to cut the amount or the volume of training and climbing that I was doing significantly. So we're talking probably 50% of the volume of climbing that I was doing. He cut that out. And then secondly is he had me do a whole load of strength and conditioning work around the upper body shoulder girdle, particularly work around on the rings and the rotator cuff. And over a period of less than 6 months, I just like rocketed in terms of my finger strength. And I don't want to give people listening the impression that you can do this and your true finger strength has moved up, because I think it needs to be caveated with the fact that in some ways my finger strength was always being underrepresented. So, can't remember if I just said that right. I think I've said representative with too many T's in it. Because I was overtrained and overly tired quite a lot of the time. So it maybe had depressed my actual finger strength. But for sure, by dropping the volume, I suddenly had the quality that went into my finger strength sessions as being just skyrocketed. I was like, whoa, I'm good sessions. I was always doing them at the start of sessions. Often I'd do them midway through sessions, or just wouldn't really do them that much at all, or I'd do it only on a system board. But I was really focusing on very, very intentional fingerboard sessions. So that was going up significantly. And then also at the same time, the way in which my shoulders were used, held, engaged in both dead hanging and on climbing changed through this strength and conditioning work. Like, I remember the first time I started trying to use the rings, and I was like a floppy piece of spaghetti. I couldn't do it at all. And that really helped.
That's so fascinating that I asked you about your finger strength and you talked about your shoulders as well. And I just think that's this underrated recognition of how connected everything is. And now it makes sense why the more testing you all have done, you want to cover more than just what your hangboard numbers are, because perhaps the weak link is somewhere in the chain that wasn't initially obvious. What were maybe some like you said that you knew you had weak fingers and you knew Ollie had crazy strong fingers. I'm curious if there is any indications for people who are maybe in that intermediate phase where they don't have someone like Ollie to say, hey, Tom, I know you got weak fingers. It's again, what are some hints that people might be more like you and could be better served from doing that same course of action so that maybe people listen and go, oh, maybe I'm like Tom?
Two things come to mind straight away is just have a look at your bouldering grade versus your sport climbing grade. So let's say you're is it most of your audience a US?
Correct.
Okay, yeah. So if you take 13B, that's 8A, isn't it? Yeah, 13B,
8A, yep.
And look at your bouldering grade. If you are bouldering only V5 or V6, but you're climbing 13B, I would argue you're really weak fingered and a fit climber. But if you're climbing 513B and you're bouldering at V11, then you're an overly strong, maybe even V12, overly strong climber and probably not fit enough. So those are the two ends of the spectrum, which are a really good way of doing it. You can probably ask on pretty much any internet forum and someone will give you numbers that roughly represent that. But you can also, you can just go and get a free assessment for your finger strength on the Lattice website as well that we have on there. So we have like a whole number of free tests. In fact, I think you can just Google it and just Google my fingers Lattice or something like that. And people can just go and do a dead hang test and it'll just give you where you are on the spectrum. And I think it marks it up as like in 8% brackets or something. So those two will work to give you a basic indicator.
Very cool. I got to ask, how, as your ring strength went up and your fingerboard went up, how did you feel different on the wall on your projects? And yeah, did you see some success there?
Yeah, massively so. Well, I went from my maximum bouldering grade at the time being around V8 to then climbing V12.
Whoa, dude.
In a pretty short time. It is also within that. It's not quite as amazing as that because I chose boulder grades. Like the V12 was a really long boulder problem. So I totally played back to my strength. But my base, like standard bouldering session grade went up to V10. And I was climbing like what you would class as just basic, more like crimpy style V10 boulder problems. And they were like limestone things, which weren't really my style either. So I wasn't kind of going for what I would typically be good at. I go do slabs or some gritstone, but I wasn't doing that.
Yeah, this is something that I've been climbing for a long time, and you often get to know someone in the gym. And you just think to yourself, you've got more potential. There's something in you that is hiding. And sometimes when I don't want to say work with these people, if I'm friends with someone, I'm climbing with them, I'm always, I don't know, we try to help each other. Everyone, it's like, hey, like without yelling beta or being a spray lord, you try to help your friends understand what you see. And I just always wish that I could somehow actualize the potential that you see, because that's where you get those stories where, hey, I jumped from, X grade and up 4. And it's not as simple as like, it wasn't just that you got that stronger. It was like, wow, this was the low hanging fruit. I always think of it that way. Like, what's the lowest hanging fruit that if I resolve, and this is where I am interested in the power of objective metrics, where you may think you know what you don't have, but are you sure? Are you really sure? Yeah. Okay. Well, I got asked, did Ollie say, hey, what would Tom do? Did you make him your guinea pig?
Yeah, we did over a number of years, and all credit to Ollie was he became that climber who was outrageously strong fingered and was just about, I think, getting up 13B to a number of years later doing long, pumpy 14Bs. And I remember belaying him on this long, like what I would class as being much more in the endurance aspect of a route, and thinking, this is just insane. I've watched someone who's completely revolutionized themselves as a climber as being about the strongest and most unfit climber I've ever assessed to now completely holding their own. But you know what? It's taken serious consistency and graft to get there. And he used all the right methods, but he could not have done that in a year. You just can't convert from being that strong and unfit to being suddenly magically fit and great power endurance in 1 year. Even with the best methods, it's just not how it works.
That's interesting to hear, because I always think of strength as being the hardest thing to acquire. And perhaps I just lean on that because I'm more on the Ollie side of being strong and not so fit. And I guess the argument I always heard made was it would be easier to take the gold medalist 100-meter sprinter and turn them into a really good, I don't know, marathon runner than vice versa. But from what I just heard you say, you were the one who had perhaps quicker results heading towards strength versus Ollie heading towards endurance. Yeah. Any more thoughts on that?
Yeah. In that case, I did have the better return, I suppose you could say it, because it was faster, and that sounds better, but I don't know whether that was actually better. It's just different. We've ended up in the long run with Ollie being a better climber than me in the long run, and I've had other reasons for not being able to maintain the things that I worked on in those original years to be able to use the knowledge that Ollie had over getting stronger. So I don't know. It's all I guess what I would say, if I was to take a very generalized picture over climbers and all the people I've seen over the years, for the most part, I would put my money on the stronger climber and making them fitter, if you gave me 5 years, over the fit climber and making them stronger. I think I can build better athletes who have more of a strength focus, because I see climbing as a strength sport. It's not a endurance sport in reality.
Wow, that's interesting. Can you say more about why you see it as a strength sport over an endurance sport?
Because of the timeframes that we're working in and the limiting factors within performance. Even in sport climbing, if you look at the limiting factor, it is in essence recovery, whether it's mediocre or relatively good, between short, medium, and long boulder problems upper face. And that's how it breaks down. You do not put a climber on the same V4 move and ask them to do V4 moves without any change to V2 or V6 for 100 moves in a row. In fact, the only time you do that is on these blooming roof cracks that I go and do with Pete, where actually it is the same thing. And you know what? Guess what? I do really well on those, and that totally plays to my strengths. So yeah, you can make that scenario, but most normal climbing doesn't look like that.
All right, that's interesting, because boy, did I feel like Los Humildes Picasso was just a slugfest that never stopped going. But that's a really good point you say, where, especially because assuming that we're talking about rock as the fundamental thing, typically, you have a whole load of different moves at different intensities. So there's always going to be that opportunity to recharge your energy system. And yeah, I love how you break it down into, well, these kind of atomized bits of how it really works. So
I think also one of the things that's kind of interesting to note from a physiological sense is that the threshold with which you recover on these rests is determined by the critical force that you have in terms of this sort of energy system, and that balance between the aerobic and anaerobic system. And when you operate in that sub anaerobic zone and you're back in your aerobic capacity, you've got that regeneration of that high intensity effort, and that is related to the degree of fitness that you have, the recovery, aerobic capacity, but also that ceiling rises the higher your strength level is as well, which is why we kind of see this interesting playoff all the time of people arguing, just get stronger, because you've got less, or the endurance ceiling will feel better because you're just stronger on every move. Others will say, just get fitter. The answer is both will work, and ideally just do both equally, and then you're a really good climber.
So let me repeat that back to you and make sure I understand it. when we think about endurance on route climbing, if you can stay in the aerobic zone on harder moves, then you're good to go. But it's those times where you kind of you don't have too long to be anaerobic. And so if you're strong enough to get through a certain area within your anaerobic ability, that's great. But if you burn out on the easier bit because you're not able to relax enough and be in that different energy system, then you're toast.
Yeah, but remember that what I was specifically referring to there was actually the recoveries, those rest points. So if you're not on a recovery and you're in that aerobic zone, you're going to slowly get more and more fatigued. And that's why you have this recovery aspect within climbing, and that's why climbing breaks down to recovery intermittently between harder sections. And if your threshold between aerobic and anaerobic is higher than everyone else's, you get to recover properly in that aerobic zone in worse and worse holds, more and more stressful positions. And that's the mark of a great climber. And Ondra, for example, is incredible at that.
All right. And that explains exactly what I said earlier, where I was like, boy, as I get better on a rope, it seems like the defining characteristic is where I can rest and what resting really means. And I always am blown away when one of my really good sport climbing friends will say, yeah, that rest right there. I think to myself, what are you talking about? Like, this isn't a rest. These are just bad holds. But then on the flip side is they say, oh, and then you grab that small crimp. And I think to myself, no, this is a great crimp. It's no big deal. And so that's the Boulder in me.
Yeah. Yeah. And a really good way for people to understand that in a practical sense is if you put someone on a foot-on campus exercise on a wall where you're on a campus board and you're kind of just laddering up and down rungs, you will find that you got on whatever size rung it is. And if you just sort of flick each hand off and you try and shake and recover once you've got pumped, is that a certain size hold, you're like, this thing just doesn't work. I'm just slowly burning out on it. But actually, if you get your fitness level up to a certain point, or you raise your base strength level, you will go on that same hold, maybe only 4 weeks ago, and you'll go, I can recover indefinitely on this hold, because you suddenly cross that threshold. As soon as you're in that zone, that aerobic zone, you are good for big chunks of time, because that aerobic zone serves energy as such, provides energy for muscle contraction for a really long time. And that's why it suddenly feels so good.
What are some of the best training things to do to increase that?
Volume. Yeah, it's volume of climbing, because this comes down to this thing around capillarization or angiogenesis, and low intensity, high volume work is the number one thing that really determines a lot of that. Unfortunately, it's also something that you can work for years and years, if not decades, and still see return on it, which is great.
I'm sure there's some people listening to this right now who are just arcing or wherever you want, that slow, long thing, that good time to listen to a climbing podcast. Okay. I was going to say, I had a buddy who broke his leg, unfortunately, in a sport climbing accident. And one of the training he was able to do was, he said that he would just sit there and try to shake out on hold. So he didn't have a partner. It was too dangerous for him to get off the ground or even to maybe get on a rope. And he said he would just find 2 holds on the wall and just sit there and see what he could shake out on. So that was his, that was his training. I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah. It definitely works. It's not, you can't just do that for sure. I would be horrified if I knew that people listened to this and went, oh, I only just went and did that. Which is why it's this classic training thing and the complexity of it. You do need to take a number of approaches and balance them.
Okay. Before we totally leave the finger training, I was wondering if there was any other things in the finger strength equation that are often overlooked but important when it comes to strength. Like it could be wrist or finger mobility. Is there something that people often don't realize is holding them back when it comes to finger strength?
So mostly it comes down to people doing too much volume of climbing so that the quality isn't in their finger strength sessions, whether it's on a fingerboard or a short bouldering system board session, they can get overly fixated and stuck in certain strength training methods for the fingers. So whether that's a certain way that they're training on a fingerboard, a certain grip type, or anything like that, they just do it for years because it worked for 2 years, and now they've suddenly done it 5 years, and they're wondering why they haven't improved. So I think fixation on certain methods is a real problem that I see a lot of. And then the other one is not getting into enough of a consistent groove throughout your climbing career of avoiding finger injuries, because there's such a setback. You have to have time off the sort of high intensity, quality, fatiguing work when you get injured, and that sets you back a little bit every time. It's one of the big determining factors, I'd say, between the very, very best climbers versus those that never quite get there, is the very best climbers are either not suffering as many injuries or much better at managing them.
Anecdotally, I would say that one of the things I've struggled with is a reoccurring shoulder injury. And it always felt like it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So I'm just going to echo that. Don't get injured, because then you get to climb more and you get to train more. And it's something that I was talking to another coach, and this idea of you need to back off volume to do finger training, but oftentimes people are excited to get stronger fingers and they layer it on, and it's just this classic thing where the psych leads to injury. And so they're trying to do the right thing, but they end up hurt. And it can be a really vicious cycle where as soon as they double down on something that they think is going to bring them to the next level, it actually sets them back. So good advice there. Don't get hurt.
Yeah.
Tom, one topic that you brought up that I thought was really interesting is this idea of replica training. And I'm going to just ask you, what is replica training, and how did you start doing it?
So replica training, in essence, is trying to create a model or a mimicking surface set of holds which represent the climbing that you're likely to do either outside or potentially in a competition as well. I guess you could call replica training still sort of useful or representing that. And the key to what you're trying to do here is build something that when you climb on your replica, it's as close as possible to the climbing that you're aiming to do and get good at and perform on. And the reason why this works so well is because you're directly addressing the specificity element within climbing. Because a lot of the time, the problem we see within training and preparation for performance is that there isn't a perfect degree of specificity. You're doing pull-ups or fingerboarding or climbing on a boulder of a different movement style or different holds compared to what you end up doing in the competition or on your project at Oleana. And so the transfer for all that hard work that you put in isn't as direct. Whereas when you do this work on a replica, the transfer is really, really good. And I've been using replica training all the way since 2009 and done a whole number of my very hardest projects basically through replica training. And I would say it's the number one reason why I've achieved those things over the years is because I've been really on it with replica training.
Yeah, I was watching a video of, I think it was you and Pete in, I want to say your garage, or sorry, your cellar of just different sized cracks, and it was all roof cracks, and just the amount of time you guys put into both creating that as well as training on it. Did it transfer really well into your experience when you visited whichever, not sure which project that one was for, but yeah, how'd that work out?
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing because one, you get the right level of strength and fitness, which relate to what you're doing. You also get to work on all the skill and technical elements in relation to your project. And we all know that climbing is such a skill-based sport, and it's amazing to kind of secretively bring in the skill element to training, because most people will often have a bit of a go at training and saying, why are you doing all this stuff? You're never working on skill. You're not a skillful technical climber. But in this case, actually, you totally are, because it's required for what you're doing on the replica training. And then the other element, which also I don't think people appreciate, is it's very good for the psychology, which is related to the route, because it makes you more confident. It gets you to understand where the stopper moves are and where you're going to have to deal with a potential lot of failure. And it also gives you a huge amount of exposure and recognition of everything, so that when you actually get to the project, the level of sort of cognitive processing that you have to do when you're there, I think, is quite a bit lower, because you've just spent so much time in what was effectively a version of the environment in which you're trying to perform. And we all know that this works in almost every element of life.
So is this something that you've built into your climbing life or your training always? Like, do you always have a project that you have your eye on, and thus you are building some sort of replica to train on? Or is this just something you use as a targeted approach in, occasionally?
I'll use it for anything which I think is near my maximum ability. That's what I mostly use it for. And then I also sometimes use it as a way to fast forward my conditioning for a particular trip or project where I haven't managed to get in enough general climbing mileage, which I think would prepare me. So I just go down the specificity route and go, right, I haven't had the 3 months previously that I was hoping for. You know what? I'm just going to have to put my time in now for a month on something which is highly specific to what I'm working towards. And it works really well for that. It's kind of a hack of time, I would say. You do have to be aware that by doing that, you can't make up for the fact that you haven't done those 3 months that you kind of wanted to have done. So when you get at the back end and you've done the project, don't go, oh, wow, I'm a better climber. I've just done my project and I'm awesome. It's get back and sort that 3 months out that you missed, because someone's got to do it at some point. Otherwise, you're going backwards as a climber.
Do you ever work with athletes who maybe they're not professionals and they have their eye on some specific famous climb? Like, you gotta imagine, if you're trying to do Perfecto Mundo, you probably should work on a right hand mono. It's gonna show up. Do you have maybe more intermediate climbers say we're going to Margalef? How do you do replica training when they don't have an exact specific goal in mind?
Yeah, really good question over how people can actually use replica training in a practical sense. The way I approach it with individuals who are in that kind of non-pro climber arena, I guess, is first question is always like, what facilities do you have to be able to do this on? Are you limited to just doing this at your local gym and trying to find random moves on the wall which represent what you're trying to do? Or are you trying to go to the kilter board and find moves that look like your project? Or do you actually have a surface at home which you can build some stuff on and play around with it, even if it's just making some really janky wooden holds for it? I'd always encourage people to do the thing that you can do at home. I think that's actually a much better environment under which to do it. Causes you to be more experimental, and also gives you a higher frequency of access to your replica, and you're more likely to get it to really represent what you're trying to do. And then once you've got your surface, whatever you want to do to be able to make your replica, there's two sides to it that I think are worth approaching. One is trying to build a replica, and whether that's individual moves or the whole thing, depending on the facilities you have, which really truly represent the shape and the size of the hold that you're actually going to climb on when you're doing your project outside. Of course, it needs to be at the same angle as what you're doing outside, because it doesn't really make sense to say you're going to be climbing on 15 mil edges outside on a 45-degree wall, but now you're doing it on a 10-degree overhanging wall inside. So it does need to be size of hold and angle. So that's one side of the replica equation. And this, just taking a problem which doesn't even represent the moves that well, can still be really valuable if you're just snatching between these holds, which really represent the exact size, kind of intensity of what you're doing. Like I've done exactly the same on crack climbing over the years. It's almost never the sequence that you actually will do on the projects outside, but they're the exact size of crack, and it works and transfers really well. The other element is to build the moves so that your body as a whole, like the entire chain, the coordination, the skill aspect, represents those moves outside. So I'll often tell people it doesn't matter that much if you've got a problem on, I don't know, the kilter board or something at home that's actually quite big, juggy holds, but completely looks and feels just like the project you have at home, because climbing is a full chain sport. So actually the skill and those movement engrams will be totally trainable by taking that approach. So if you can do both the size, the intensity of those holds, but also the movement, you can fill most of the requirements in terms of replica training without having a perfect 3D modeled version of the climb. And it will work really well.
I also got to point out that it will help with injury prevention, or it'll make it less likely that you get hurt when you go and experience these holds the first time if you have some kind of exposure to it. A quick question on this idea of replicas and kind of the idea of goal setting. Do you encourage climbers to have specific climbs in mind? Like where is that factor into getting better in general? Like if I was telling you I was going to go to Margalef, would you say, hey, Josh, it'd be a good idea for you to pick a specific climb that you're inspired by? Or do you think that can lead to problems? Yeah. How do you think about goal setting like that?
So I nearly always allow an individual to be self-motivated by the goal setting. So I will almost never suggest goals to a client. I think this on the whole is a mistake. I'll guide them towards finding their own goal, but really you should be coming up with your goal. So if you come to me and you say, I have a really specific climb at Margalef that I really want to do, I'm behind you and I'll go and do that. But likewise, if you say, I just want to go on a trip and go and climb a load of my first 513s and I'm going to try a few different ones, I'll go, great, this sounds really cool, and I'll support you in doing that. So actually, I would say I would never guide anyone towards, a specific replica or a specific route at all. It depends on whether they approach me on doing that.
By the way, going to Margalef and climbing a bunch of 513s is really, 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 really fun. And I've been there once and just had a blast doing the exact thing that, got me flashback. You mentioned something about exact 3D replicas, which now do exist. And I think you worked with Will Bosey on a Bird in the Dreams replica. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, so this whole thing came about because Aidan Roberts had gone and got some scans of the holds, who is another athlete that we worked with since, I don't actually know the exact year, but he's worked with Ollie Tor for quite some time. And he'd got the 3D scans, and then a company just around the corner from Lattice Training had made the exact replicas of the holds. And I think Aidan had originally got hold of them for training on his board at home, but then we ended up with the copies of them being down at Lattice, and Will was curious about the climb and wanted to try the replica holds out to work out, I guess, if he wanted to actually go and put the time into training for it, but also the trip and travel time. So it ended up being this really cool scenario where someone got to test the waters as such and work out whether they liked the hold shapes, how well they got on with the problem, and train on it ahead of going over there. So they could, one, have a trip that was more motivating, not go and spend a load of time out from what is really quite a busy schedule for Will of travel and sponsor responsibilities, etc., and have a much shorter trip because he'd already really climbed on the actual problem a lot because it was a very good, very, very good replica.
Yeah, well, we all know how that turned out. He was successful. When was on this replica that's, at some of the hardest climbing that we know about, what did he do to work it out? Because I assume he didn't just walk up and have success right away. What were his techniques of using a replica to this greatest advantage? Did he move the holds ever? Because you can replicate it perfectly, but perhaps you can't do that, and you have to kind of move the foothold one T-nut closer. How did he go about, using the replica to the best advantage he could?
Yeah, so the way that I remember Will doing this was he did what you would call sort of classic chunking process. So you break everything down into little manageable chunks. And for him, that was trying each individual move on its own and building up a repertoire, or not a repertoire, that's not quite the right word, but building up the ability to be able to do each of the individual moves before then starting to think about linking things together. And that's a very normal way, I would say, of breaking down a replica or any hard project. And if that's not possible immediately within a few sessions, and I would say Will would normally at least give a few sessions of patience to just keep trying the moves until they were done, rather than going, oh no, I need to try a different method. You might reverse back and reverse chunk a next layer down, which is, can I hold the positions between the holds and then move my feet to set up to the next move? Or can I hold the positions between the holds and just release a hand and throw the hand towards the hold? So it all just ends up being this chunking process of building it, breaking it down into manageable parts that you can at least have a degree of success in, so you feel good, but you also get the ability to have repetition, so you're improving your skill on that boulder problem, and then you're just adding a little bit to it all the way through. So what I watched Will do was go through the first 2 sessions where he could only do some of the individual moves and hadn't even done all of them, to then doing all of the moves and then creating little bits of, I actually did 2 moves in a row, or I did a move plus a foot move, and then just slowly building that together and adding it time on time. Then I think he reached a bit of a standpoint where he wasn't really going forward particularly, and he had a bit of a mess around with some pulleys and taking weight off for some of the moves to see whether that would adjust things. I think it was, in reality, maybe not a game changer doing that, but it did pique his curiosity. I think he thought it was fun and it was interesting and it was cool to try a mad thing out like that. Like, I love doing things like that. And so it kept him occupied for another session or 2, messing around with that method. And before you know it, you've put in a few more sessions on it. And actually now you're linking things. And that's how he prepared for that climb in that way, was just slowly chunking it down and building it up. If he had more time, then he might have potentially had the ability to be able to go back and say, right, on this hold over here, I'm holding it in this grip position, which isn't my strongest grip position, but I have to on that particular hold. So you could go back and work that on a system board or a fingerboard to improve that. But you normally need much longer amounts of time to be able to go back and do some of that base work.
How wild is it that pulley idea is wild, and I think it's really cool and innovative. It's not totally dissimilar from getting pushed through a move by a friend, which is a really common technique. But it does make me think of this thing that they tried in sprinting, where they would have sprinters run with a parachute behind them, or even a weight, some kind of resistance. And what they found is that it didn't work so well because it changed the technique of the running itself, and just didn't quite translate. But just kind of cool. I got to ask, did he send the indoor climb before he went to Burden of Dreams?
No, I don't think he did. I think he got pretty close, if I remember rightly, but he was doing quite a lot. feel like I remember at the same time he had some trips and he was going over to Czech Republic and climbing with Adamondra, and he was trying to battle his skin plus trips. He's not in Sheffield the whole time. It was a bit of a juggle, basically. So I don't think he actually did the project beforehand, but he got very close, if I remember rightly.
One of the reasons I asked is because we were joking before about, I had this argument that I thought the world's first V18 would be indoors. And you said, no way, Josh. And so what makes you think that the world's first V18 is going to end up being outdoors instead of indoors?
I think it all comes down to the fact that the kudos in achieving V18 is massively weighted towards doing it outside. The first person that does V18, people will go, oh my goodness, that's amazing, that's sick, where's the video? Oh, I want to go and visit and just go and touch the holes, I want to see that, blah blah blah, you're the best boulderer in the planet, news headlines, everything like that. Someone does V18 on a circuit board or splatter board somewhere in, I don't know, it could even be somewhere well known like Boulder, Colorado. People go, cool, but have you climbed V16 on real rock? Like that's what will happen. The social kudos is not there, and therefore I will say people won't do it because it requires too much effort for not enough reward. We're egotistical individuals and we need the reward.
I like that. Is a good argument. Although the reason why I asked then about Will doing the replica first is if you made a replica of the V18 boulder to train on indoors and then you do it first, maybe you call that V18. But well, I like the idea of a little friendly wager there. I think that I just, maybe the V18 is far enough away that the idea of what achievement is will shift to plastic being achievement unto itself, which seems to be more of a thing with things like the kilter board and the moon board and the tension board, where people seem to take it more seriously. And it's funny, there's this climb on the 2016 moon board, Black Beauty, which is a trainer for lucid dreaming. And it's a big deal when people do Black Beauty. They I don't know if it's quite as a big deal as doing lucid dreaming, but boy, are people impressed. So I'll take the other side of that. I'll go for V18 on plastic. That's my hot take.
Okay. Well, you're on.
Yeah. I think the wager should be that whoever gets the next, or your next FA or my next FA, has to be something very positive about the other person. So if you win and I do an FA, I'll say something like, Tom is the most handsome ever, or something like that.
No, we can't do that. Maybe you have to give the FA name to the other person, and you cannot back down from whatever they choose to do. So if they decide to screw you over, that's what you have to deal with.
It's like giving up your firstborn. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
You briefly said something about Aiden and Burden of Dreams, and it made this thing pop up in my head that I've heard. I want to say Ollie Tor talked about Aiden and this idea of high angle crimping. And it's just a topic that I feel like hasn't been addressed much. Like, what is high angle crimping, and why the hell does Aiden crimp so freaking well?
This, I'm going to give you a really unsatisfying answer. I don't know. I don't work with Aiden. He's never been my athlete, and this is a topic of specialization with Ollie. So I'm going to have to just put my hands up and say I know a little bit about it, but not enough to, I feel like, even give you a great answer. I'm sorry.
I'm obsessed with it because I'm someone who has quote unquote strong fingers, but when you put me on a little 6 mil edge, when I watch what Aiden does, I just am blown away. And I'd love for you guys. I know there was a YouTube video that Aiden did kind of explain how he does well on crimps, and there was, mobility and all this stuff, but there's something more going on. I want to see the ultrasound of his fingers and the angle, and compared to other strong crimpers that maybe don't have the same success. So that's my request for content from you guys, because he's specialist in that.
I guess one thing I can say about it is that I feel like most climbers, after enough years of experimenting with different grip types, the way that they perform and train, will be pretty good intuitively in understanding their own bodies and how they kind of milk them for the best advantages. And Aiden has done that, and he uses that really high angle crimp, and he's understood that that's a weapon to use in his hard climbing. But it certainly isn't the path that I would go down if you took Will and Aiden, very, very similar bouldering strength, but physiologically completely different climbers. If you just look at Will's shoulders, even taking away from even the hands, versus Aiden's shoulders, and how they move and how strong they are in different positions, they're totally different climbers, but yet they climb the same grade because they play to their own advantages and they work around their own weaknesses to make it work. It's just that the advantages of those two individuals is not so great over the others, and likewise vice versa for the weaknesses, which is why they climb an almost identical grade.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating about climbing even this elite level, is looking at the different bodies, the success people have. It still surprises me that with the evolution we've seen of climbing, that there hasn't been a further distillation of a specific body morphology that's like, look, everyone is between this height, everyone looks like this. Where if you looked at, I don't know, swimming or maybe like basketball playing, like I'm probably not going to be a NBA 7 foot tall basketball guy anytime soon. And in climbing, we're still seeing quite a bit of variation. So that's my last question for you in the testing world is, you have tested some of the strongest climbers we've ever seen. Do you have any fun stories or anything that has surprised you, either on the spectrum of, wow, I can't believe that strength existed, or similarly, wow, I can't believe how weak that professional climber might be compared to their peers?
Yes, I have two stories as such. One was when Magnus Mitbo came over to test with us, and we made a video with him. I think it ended up on his channel, maybe not ours. And I was a little bit, I suppose, skeptical about the ability of Magnus, because I felt like he'd sort of like passed his heyday. He was he'd become a YouTuber. He hadn't focused on his professional climbing career quite as much. And maybe he was just kind of, I don't know, like outrageously strong fingers. And that's really why he'd done some of the stuff he did. And that's where he was at. But actually, as it quickly turned out when we did the testing, that guy is such an all-round physiological beast in every sense, and complemented with very, very good psychology, like performance psychology. And it blew me out of the water. Like blew my mind. I just went, wow, he's really quite strong, but he's very, very good power endurance. His fitness is really, really excellent. And then we actually made a mistake of a test that we put him on, where we doubled the amount of time that he should have done this test. And it's a hideous test. I don't mind trying hard. I don't mind kind of suffering. And having to do this test for 8 minutes that we accidentally put him on over the 4 minute that he should have done is horrendous. And he didn't complain, and he just pushed on through. And he'd also stacked this on top of a load of other tests, which normally people don't even have to do before the normal 4 minute test. And that for me was a good incident where I went, there's a reason here why Magnus was cutting edge back in the day, and the level at which he was on-sighting red pointing, got really close to Neanderthal in Santa Linea, and all these things. And that's why it's not just a strong set of fingers on a good comp climber. So that was a good eye opener for sure.
That's cool to hear that he delivered on the test. I think I want to say I watched that video, but it's been a minute. And I remember when he was training for Neanderthal, and he was kind of one of the guys out there. And my buddy Ethan Pringle, who is a great sport climber, said he was over there training with Magnus at a gym, and that he was just blown away by Magnus's endurance in his training. Just like, wow, you're still going? You're going to do another lap on that? So yeah, I feel like the general public probably looks at Magnus and, you know, thinks he's really strong. And then some climbers might think, oh, well, you know, he's just a YouTuber. No, he's special. He's a beast. That's cool to hear that came through there.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other one would be a guy that no one will know his name, but he's called John. And I tested him at a similar time to when we tested Alex Honnold and first started working with him. And I know Alex outside of the lattice testing arena as well as just like a climber. And I would say I've made, quite a lot of observations about how Alex is as a person. And know him reasonably well around the way that he communicates, the types of words he uses, and how he is around hard climbing and also some relatively dangerous climbing as well. Anyway, when we tested Alex, he came out right at the bottom of the spectrum of just really kind of weak, relatively unfit for his grade. And it was, wow. Like, you just could do some physical training, and I think you'd see some really big improvements in your grade. But really impressed, very, very impressive of what you've achieved on that physical status that you have as a climber. Super impressive, like one of the best that we've seen. We also had this guy, John, who when he did his testing, performed unbelievably badly on strength testing and power endurance testing. And I was like, how on earth are you actually climbing these grades that you're doing? This is really unusual, a real outlier. But what was very interesting for me as a tester coach was the way that John spoke and the language that he used was so similar to Alex. It was like a carbon copy of their two personalities. And I remember I heard him say the first couple of things. I went, that sounds like Alex Honnold. That's odd. And then he said a few more things. I went, and I started to really notice it. I went, this is just, and he's maybe 25 years older than Alex. And it was just another really interesting profiling session where I realized that you've got two individuals separated by a generation, both very poor metrics, but incredible performance. But guess what? Their sort of psychology and the communication around things is almost identical. If you could profile that, you probably would see the same sort of scores in them. Fascinating.
That is really interesting that there was something that was ineffable, but then when you heard them speak about climbing, you picked up on it as a superpower that they lean into. And it's funny, Alex Honnold often says, oh, I'm not such a good climber, I'm so weak. And then you watch him climb and you think to yourself, wow, does this guy climb just beautifully. The way he moves on the wall is gorgeous. And he may be underrated in the climbing community as being such an amazing climber because people, see him doing his, relatively dangerous stuff, but that sometimes covers up his just extreme actual ability on rock. So interesting, man. Tom, thanks for taking the time with. Oh, actually, before I let you go, I always have this one question. We're talking about the greatest in our sport right now, and you've helped some of them get there and continue on that path. What do you think it takes to go from good to great?
I think it is It's the ability to focus and avoid distractions when climbing is a really complex sport. So how much can you, even at the point where you're already a really good climber, you've got lots of training options, lots of facilities available, you can travel all over the world to go and do lots of different things, and you understand yourself really well, can you actually hone in and consistently work on the things that matter? I think that is a big differentiating factor between good and great, because the greatest climbers I've met over the years are very, very focused in different ways, but I think, yeah, very, very focused. I also think that the greatest climbers have also spent a huge amount of what you call time on task. So they do lots and lots of climbing. I've met many climbers over the years who are really good climbers, but actually, if you look at the amount that they've climbed over the last 10 to 20 years, it's just less than the greatest. They're still doing plenty, but often they're maybe holding down a job, or they've got a family, or they've not got enough access to rock that they kind of could do with compared to the greatest. So I think that's another really big thing. And then lastly is injury avoidance and management. You will not find many of the greatest climbers in the world who have said, yeah, I have a nightmare with injuries. I don't manage them very well. I've had quite a lot of periods in my life where I've had a lot of time out. There are a few people that I can think who are in that. I think you could probably put Alex Puccio in that great category. And yes, she has had some real big injury setbacks, but physiologically, she is an absolute phenomenon beyond almost every other pro female climber. So let's not forget that as well, that goes into that equation. But yeah, those are the things I would say mark out the greatest.
All right. Tom says, ditch my family, quit my job. Good to go.
Yeah, pretty much.
Pretty much. Yeah, there is something about just time doing the thing. And it's something that I've talked about is this idea of reframing volume, where I know that you need to sometimes take a step back and train specific things to, one step backwards to go 2 steps ahead. But sometimes people underestimate just how much professional climbers actually climb. And it blows my mind when some of the people that I know who are professionals who are climbing like 6 days a week. Now it doesn't mean they're on the moon board 6 days a week, but they're out there doing it. And boy, does that add up over the years, that intention and focus. So good stuff, Tom. Thanks again for joining me when it's a little bit late over there, although you told me you're a night owl, so that's great. And I also just want to thank you for being someone who started a movement at a time in climbing that probably was a little different than the people around them. So bringing those skills that you had acquired before, and then bringing some objectivity into climbing, and then just continuing to push it forward over the decade. And I also know that you have your hands in a lot of climbing, the climbing world, and that you've put a lot of work in. And I just appreciate that. The content you guys put out, the work you do is appreciated by the community and appreciated by me.
Oh, that's really nice to hear. And I mean, I've had so much out of climbing over the years, and it's given me so much on so many different levels. And I really, really enjoy being able to share back some of the stuff that I've got from climbing over the years, and particularly on like education and things like that, because I love information sharing. It's just like a massive passion of mine.
Yeah. And it's, as we were talking about, it's such a complex sport. And, sometimes we get a little esoteric and sometimes abstract, because not everything has been quantified in climbing, and it's a muddy way forward that everyone has to go at in their own. And so having even some touch points to have as baselines, and this is why coaching can be so important, is to have someone help guide you through those muddy waters. So good stuff, man. I had a blast chatting with you.
Yeah, it's been really, really good fun. I've really enjoyed this podcast, and just thanks so much for having me on board and having great questions and putting up with going into a bit of detail and getting a bit geeky about it.
My pleasure. My only complaint is that I had to make sure we didn't cover too much. There was too much to cover in a long podcast. It still feels short. So maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Take care, Tom. Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like even more content, go to patreon.com/Testpiece. And while you're at it, share this podcast with someone you know who would love it. And please leave us a review or rating at wherever you get your podcasts. We've also got tons of great content on YouTube and Instagram, so don't forget to like and subscribe there. Okay, see you next week.